All right. Thanks everyone for coming again. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Brooke Love. She has a doctorate from UW studying deep sea hot springs and building instrumentation, and she is the new program director for the Marine and Coastal Sciences program at Western, which is kind of a collaboration between several departments there. And she's currently researching how ocean acidification affects marine food webs and how marine plants can alter local acidification conditions, which is what she'll be talking about today. So, Dr. Brooke Love.
I'm Brooke, and yeah, I'm happy to be here today to talk with you guys. So, I don't know how to use this to advance the slides. Oh, it doesn't work for advancing slides. Oh, okay, great. So I like to thank people in the beginning instead of the end. There's a whole bunch of people who have been involved in some of the research that I'm going to talk about, particularly Christina and Tyler and Kale, who have been some of my graduate students recently, and then a bunch of the other faculty, staff, and students at Western and at Shannon Point Marine Center. I always like to give a little shout out for Western when I come out to talk to groups outside of Western. I'm sure you guys are all probably familiar already with how some of the good stuff that Western does. But it's a really great place to work and teach and do research. And you know, our students are out there really experiencing and learning about our local environments, and you know, and then going off and doing things like Fulbright scholarships and Peace Corps were really surprisingly successful in sending students out to opportunities like those. So I think it really speaks well of our students that they care about solving problems and trying to make a practical difference out there. So I'm very proud of them. And I'm also really excited we have this new marine science major, Marine and Coastal Sciences, which is getting started at Western. A lot of people are surprised to know that we didn't have one up until now. We had a concentration in the biology department and one in environmental sciences, but the idea of this program is to really bring together a lot of expertise that exists at Western in terms of marine science, and bring it all together into one program so that students and faculty can really collaborate more effectively. Yes? Biology or neither one. It's an interdisciplinary program, so it's biology, environmental sciences, geology, and the Shannon Point Marine Center are all cooperating as part of it. Yes? That was the original concept, and it's morphed a little bit more towards marine and coastal at this point, partially because it's just a lot of ground to cover in a limited kind of amount of space and time that we have in a curriculum for an undergraduate program. So. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about ocean acidification. I mean, this is sort of the basic framework. You know, we want to make sure that, first of all, everybody understands what ocean acidification is and why we should care and what we should do about it. The why we should care part is where some of the science that we've been working on comes in terms of herring and eelgrass and all of that. But I'd like to do just a quick poll so I can kind of get a sense of where you guys are about what you already know about ocean acidification. So if you're have totally read up on it and yes, I'm up on ocean acidification, be like this. And if you're okay, I've kind of heard of it, but I don't really know a whole lot. Or if you're somewhere in between, can you get a show of hands? Okay, so we've got both ends of the spectrum. So I'll definitely go over some of the basics, but try not to dwell on it too much. Okay, so 20 trillion pounds of CO2 are added every year to the ocean from fossil fuel burning, which so it's like a 2 with just a whole bunch of zeros behind it, right? It's really hard to conceptualize a number that big. Yes.
Is that all the oceans on the planet, just the Pacific? Or?
That's the oceans in general. Yes. So that's a lot. But let me put that in a little bit of context for you, give you a visualization. That's the equivalent of every single person on Earth putting a bowling ball worth of CO2 into the ocean every day. So you can imagine yourself going down to the beach, you know, hauling your bowling ball down there in the morning, heaving it in, right? And since we live in an industrialized country, I'm sure you guys are all really virtuous, but even if you're super virtuous, you've probably got at least 2 bowling balls, maybe like 5, depending on your choices or your situation. So that's, you know, the oceans are really, really big, but that is a lot of CO2. So the effect of that is that over time, CO2 goes up. I think this stopped working. Is this still working? Okay. So CO2 levels are going to double, approximately. Bicarbonate goes up. These are the different chemical constituents of the carbonate system. They're all connected to each other through a series of equilibria. So CO2 goes in, it causes carbonate to go up, and bicarbonate to go up, and it causes carbonate to go down. So why does that matter? Well, CO2 and to some extent bicarbonate are the source of carbon for photosynthesis. So I've got some sort of happy algae here. In general, this is not universal, but many photosynthesizers do well when there's more CO2. It's more of the raw material that they need for photosynthesis. Things that need carbonate to make their shells, which are generally made of calcium carbonate, do not do so well. So I've got my sort of sad little shell here. Again, this is a general pattern, not universal. But that's kind of the big picture. And then I got a little herring here with a question mark. We're getting to that. So that's the big picture. The history of pH over time in the ocean. You can see here that this is the present time right here, and this is pH on the up and down axis. This is 400,000 years ago over here. You can see the pH kind of bounces around between like 8.2, 8.3 or so over the last 400,000 years. If you spend a lot of time looking at climate stuff, you'll recognize the glacial, interglacial cycles in there. And then this is the prediction for the next, 100 years or so. I guess 80 years at this point. So it'll go down from 8.1, which is where we currently are, to about 7.8. If you look at it this way, it's like, okay, like it's going down, but I don't know. I mean, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But if you put them both on the same time scale, what's happening now is just an arrow going straight down, right? Compared to the recent geological time scale, the changes that are happening now are very big and very fast in terms of ocean chemistry. So just kind of a summary of things to know about OA in general. About 25% of the CO2, maybe 30% that we generate has been absorbed by the oceans already. Ocean acidity is increased by 30%. And it's going to increase by another 100 or 150%. And it's doing so at a rate that's 10 times faster than any time over the last 50 million years. So, like I said, big changes happening fast. All right, so we've got CO2 increasing in the atmosphere, which causes lower pH in the ocean, which causes adverse biological effects, or can. So let's talk about some of those adverse biological effects. I'm sure some of you guys know what this is. What is it? It's a mollusk. Yeah, it is a mollusk. Yeah, these ones over here are oysters. This one right here is a pteropod. A pteropod. There's a marine snail. This is all called a sea butterfly sometimes. I should get a video of it on here. These are like little fins here, but it sort of flaps it like Dumbo wings, kind of. They're cute. They're really tiny. They're a major food for salmon, among other things, and a lot of other marine fish. They're very susceptible to ocean acidification. This shell that they have is made out of a form of calcium carbonate that dissolves especially easily. So we're seeing effects of ocean acidification along the Pacific coast on these guys already. It's not a future effect, it's something that's already happening.
Are pteropods visible or are they microscopic? Can you see them when they're out there? Are they in color?
That's a good question. I don't think that they're generally sort of in blooms where you would be able to see them easily. Like, I think they are, like if there was one like in a little jar and you kind of squinted, you could probably see it. They're big enough to see, certainly. Yeah. Okay. So, let's talk about oysters for a minute. Who's familiar with the story of our local oysters and ocean acidification? Yeah, yep, several of you are. So I'll just give you a brief overview. So back in 2009 or so, the local hatcheries who supply oyster spat, like the little baby oysters, to our local aquaculture oyster farms, had huge mortality in their oyster larvae. Like they were like 90% of them were just dying. And at first they thought maybe it was like a virus, but it turned out that it was the water that they were bringing in through their pumps was too acidic. And these little baby oysters, you can see they're very small, and they're not able to feed yet. They only have a certain amount of energy that's kind of in their yolk, right? And they have to build a shell and they have to build their feeding parts in the sort of several days of their initial development. And it takes more energy to build a shell when the water is acidic. So they either don't build a shell or they like don't build their feeding parts. Anyway, it's really bad for the baby oysters. A lot of them die. So that was a problem. So I like to ask people a lot of questions when I don't like to be the only one talking. So not too many of you said you were familiar with this story, so let's have a little brainstorming here. If you were in charge of an oyster hatchery, what would you do in this situation? Like the water that you normally pump in, it's killing all your oysters. Make a filter? Yeah, so do something to make the water, to fix the water, right? Add lime. Yeah, so it's hard to filter out CO2, but you could add something that would make it more basic, that would reduce the acidity. Hatch them somewhere else. They're doing that. Yeah. Yeah, so those are some of the basic strategies that they did do. So add carbonate, bicarbonate to the water, or go somewhere else. They built a hatchery in Hawaii. That's actually connected to a saltwater aquifer. It's not connected to the open ocean at all. The Taylor did that. I'm talking about Taylor here. Another one is manage around the problem. So this is pH in their intakes. And you can see it's like 7.8 right here and 8.6 right there. That's over the course of a day. That's a really big change. I don't know if you remember from the other one, like the total change that we were talking about was going from like 8.1 to 7.6. So this is like twice the difference of like a century that's happening in a day. And that's because there's a big eelgrass bed out there near their intakes. It's just photosynthesizing like crazy, and it brings the pH way up during the day, and then it goes way back down again at night. So if you just turn on your pumps when the water is good, and turn them off when it's bad, that's a stopgap measure as well. Okay, so, and also you can, the oceanographers can help you out and let you know when the pH is going to be extra low because of currents and upwelling and oceanographic conditions. So this is kind of their three-phase response, is in the short term, monitoring and research, enable producers to dodge the bad water, and then also treating it if there's no way to dodge it. Medium term, cultivate more resilient broodstock. There was actually just a news story came up on my phone today about how out at Manchester they're breeding super oysters. But they're finding the ones that are more resistant and then breeding them together. And just like the way that people have bred animals throughout our history to encourage the traits that we want. So breeding. And then long term, promote policies to reduce emissions, strengthen research and monitoring, right? I mean, you have to get to the root of the problem at some point, which involves reducing emissions. Okay, so we talked about, we have a couple examples of adverse effects, but not all biological impacts are adverse when we talk about adding carbon to the ocean. So, Zostera marina, our well-beloved local species of eelgrass. A lot of studies have been done that show that when you have really high CO2, the eelgrass loves it. It like grows more longer shoots and it grows more rhizomes, it grows more quickly because it has more carbon to work with. So it has a little bit of a carbon as a limitation, and when you release that, it grows. So, however, it's a little more complicated than that. It's always more complicated than that, right? This is my student Tyler with one of his, part of one of his eelgrass experiments. So these experiments that were done, basically they put it in like really, really high CO2. And the eelgrass was like, yay! But at realistic levels of CO2, of like what we would see around here now or what we would expect to see, the differences are pretty small. So you can tell that there's a difference, but probably not enough of a difference to really make the conditions that much better. Although the people who do the research that say that eelgrass does really well under high CO2 don't like it when I say that. So it does like having extra CO2, but it might not be like a total slam dunk for eelgrass to be like, yeah, totally happy in the future, especially if you're adding differences in temperature, for instance. So the effect of CO2 on the growth of eelgrass here is probably pretty small, realistically, but the effect of the growth of eelgrass on CO2 can be very large. Like, remember that graph we saw where the CO2 was going up and down like crazy? That's because the eelgrass is photosynthesizing, and if there's enough of it, it can have a really big effect on the CO2 that's in the water and the conditions for the animals and plankton and so forth that are living nearby. So, and the eelgrass may help residents in other ways as well. So, like the sediment trapping effect that Eleanor mentioned, there have been studies that have shown that oysters that are raised inside of eelgrass beds seem to do better. And it doesn't appear to be because the CO2 conditions are better, but maybe because they're actually getting more food. Because the plankton are sort of trapped and slowed down inside those environments. Maybe. That's not like totally set in stone at all, but these are some of the questions that we're looking at. Okay, so what do we know about ocean acidification effects on various different species? So this paper came out not too long ago, and they looked at, they tried to do an assessment of like, what do we know about sort of Pacific Northwest species in general? So the color coding on here is that red means that it's bad, blue means it's good, gray means we don't know, little dots means like maybe bad, but we're really not sure at all. So these ones are the farmed species groups. So we know ocean acidification is pretty much solidly bad for most shellfish because it compromises their shells. Probably bad for salmon. Like, think about the pteropods, those little snails that they eat, the food web effects, but a little shaky on that. And then if we look at wild species groups, one thing that jumps out at me is there's just a lot of gray. Right? There is a lot that we don't know. So down here at the bottom, phytoplankton, they've made blue. So for the most part, they like it when there's more carbon. Macroalgae is mixed. Seagrass they put as yellow, which is likely neutral. So there's probably some positive effects, some negative effects. Maybe none of them are that big. So they put that in the neutral category. So you see a lot of shellfish. These pteropods that we mentioned, abalone, gooey ducks, they're all red. And then most everything else is gray that we just really don't know. It's hard to put the picture together. And I'll highlight herring here, which are gray. We'll delve into that a little bit more as we go on. Okay, so far, our picture of ocean acidification is like CO2 in the atmosphere, it goes in the water, it does stuff to the animals and plants. So let's add another layer onto that. Because, you know, this is what the ocean looks like around here, right? It's not just like a bathtub with some air over it. It's surrounded by land and roads and forests and cities and all kinds of stuff, all of these interactions that are going on. So let's add another part to this. So nutrients. We've added some nutrients over here, which are causing algal blooms. Those algal blooms get, oh, I've got some pictures. So here's an algal bloom, and then the bloom is, you know, dying, sinking, decaying, and using up the oxygen. So we get low oxygen, which can lead to adverse biological effects. So we can have both of these things happening together. That decay also releases CO2 at the same time. So that's another thing we really need to think about when we're thinking about ocean acidification. If we try to put together sort of even a bigger level picture of coastal processes, you know, we've got this production and respiration going on, which might be driven by nutrients that are coming in from rivers and so forth. We've got sediment exchange, we've got exchange with the atmosphere, and we have upwelling. So when the winds drive the water offshore, deep water comes up from below to replace it. And that deep water has lots of CO2 in it. It has low oxygen generally and lots of nutrients, which are sort of fueling this whole situation we're talking about here. And we know that in the future, that input from the open ocean, from that upwelling, is getting more acidic over time. That atmospheric signal takes some time, but it does get entrained in that upwelling water. Yes?
Do you know how old that water is? Deep water?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the deep water in like the North Pacific is on the order of 1,000 years old. But the sort of added signature of the CO2 that's coming in with it is, I think, being entrained from more midwater. And I want to say it's kind of on the order of 50 years old. I would have to double check that. So yeah, it's a little behind, but not that far. Okay, so we know that that's getting more acidic over time. And then what's the future of nutrients? They've certainly gone up over time as human population and impacts have increased. So things are certainly changing in this coastal area and in the Salish Sea in terms of both of these aspects of ocean acidification. All right. Here's a picture of Vidia Bay, or Padilla, depending on how you want to say it. And in the shallow water, with all this grass, the CO2 is all over the place. If you've been out there on a low tide, one of the like really interesting things around sort of a moderate tide where you can stand there kind of knee deep in eelgrass is that there's this sort of like Rice Krispie type sound from all the bubbles that are forming, which is oxygen forming on the leaves, on the shoots of the eelgrass, and then sort of effervescing up to the surface. It's really magical. So at the same time it's creating all that oxygen, it's sucking all the CO2 out of the water at the same time. So the water chemistry in places where there's a lot of grass is wildly variable. Which might beg the question, okay, so if it's going up and down in this wild fashion every day, then does this long-term change really matter? And I would argue that it does. If you think about this sort of simple scenario that I've laid out here, and the red shading at the top indicates some sort of physiological threshold where the high CO2 is going to cause serious problems for your organism. And you're bouncing around all the time, but you're not in the red zone. But if your baseline that you're bouncing around is going up over time, well then over time you're going to be hitting these conditions that are really damaging to your organism every day. And that could certainly be a problem. The flip side of that, which is something that Eleanor mentioned also, which is that although It's also possible that this organism that's used to bouncing around all the time may be more resilient to these types of changes. And that's something that people are really trying to look into in terms of the science as well. Okay, so Washington State was really on the forefront of trying to get ahead of ocean acidification as a problem and understand it and understand what we should do. The Blue Ribbon Panel. And the first two recommendations of the panel were address the root cause of ocean acidification by reducing carbon dioxide emissions and reduce local land-based pollutants that worsen ocean acidification. So those are those two pathways that we kind of looked at in that diagram. So I promise we're going to get to herring. So let's talk about that a little bit. So I know I'm preaching to the choir here, and I know there's people here who are certainly more expert on this than I am. But let's have a little discussion for a minute. What are some of the things that can be done to do those things, to reduce carbon and nutrients locally? Vote. Yes. Yes. Stormwater. Yeah.
First, I have a question. It's kind of a global thing, especially with this vote coming up in 1631. Reducing sources of CO2 in Washington State, is that going to have a local effect or more global effect?
Great question. Yeah, there have been studies that have come out recently that show that, in fact, a significant amount of the carbon in our local waters is generated locally. So the previous model was that CO2 is well mixed in the atmosphere and it's a global problem and like every little bit counts, but it's sort of spread out everywhere. But it turns out that that's not quite true, and that the local, very localized kind of atmospheric conditions and our own carbon emissions really do actually make a difference for our local waters. And of course, for the global picture as well. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You gonna pass on the microphone?
So, from what he said, then a country that has high CO2, if they reduce it, it will make a difference in their part of the world, correct?
Yeah,
And that's a good thing.
absolutely.
So, each person or each area, even each part of the coast that does it, makes a big difference. So is that a way of reducing it worldwide?
I mean, I think so, that it may be a way for people to be motivated, right? That to understand that their local actions do make a difference locally as well, for carbon and for nutrients. Yeah. Yes.
Now, does BC and Canada, do they have any kind of a carbon tax? Or I think they're doing something up there, aren't they? What I'm getting to is, are there any local changes? Are we seeing a difference in the CO2 ocean acidification up north?
I heard people murmuring about your question about whether BC is doing something. So I don't know, but are they? They are going to have a carbon tax? Yeah. Because our conditions are so variable, it's very difficult to detect small changes over time. So if there were an effect of these policies, I think it would take quite a bit of time, and you would want to be pretty careful about pinning, like, this change is because of that. That's something that scientists are cautious about.
All the outfalls from sewage treatment plants, do they have a measurable effect on ocean acidification?
Yeah, good question. So the Department of Ecology has done a big study on nitrogen in the Sound, and the sewage treatment outfalls are, after the ocean, one of the biggest inputs for nitrogen. So when we think about acidification as this combination of atmospheric carbon and nutrient inputs both being important, then yes, absolutely. The input from sewage outfalls is a big part of that, mostly through the nutrient part of that story. more so than the carbon part. Yeah? Yeah, that's one of the biggest things that I did have a slide about nitrogen inputs, but I took it out so I could make more room for herring. But yeah, that's one of the areas that we have the most leverage on, that we could do something about nutrients. We could do more about nutrients in our wastewater. Yes. That's right, is input that's coming in through the Strait of Juan de Fuca from the open ocean. Yeah, there's a lot of water that comes in there, far more than comes from rivers or outfalls or anything like that, and it has a lot of nitrogen in it. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. One of the most fun ideas that I think they're trying out in terms of this idea of reducing carbon and nutrients is this kelp farm. This is a experimental kelp farm that they have out in Hood Canal, where they've got these lines set up and then they're growing sugar kelp on them, and it's removing carbon and nutrients from the water. And the idea is then you harvest the kelp and you do something else with it. Normally it would, just decay and all of those things would go back into the water. The part about doing something else with it, they're still working out. But I think it's an interesting idea. There are people who sort of have this idea that we should have large-scale aquaculture of marine plants, and that will help with this. There's certainly some upsides to that, although it is taking a natural environment and making it into a farmed environment, which is a discussion that people could have. So points to remember. Oceans are becoming more acidic because of carbon dioxide. Salish Sea, we're talking about nutrient inputs and runoff, as well as upwelling are part of that story. There's a lot of variability in this Salish Sea over time and space, and local action can influence our waters. Okay, so there are a lot of things we still don't know. For instance, what's the adaptive capacity of organisms? We do these experiments where we sort of take a sea urchin and stick it in a jar with high CO2, which isn't exactly what's happening out there, right? So and people are looking at this as far as we can. It's a difficult experiment to do. Ecosystem effects and feedbacks, that's why there's all that gray on that sort of picture of what we know and what we don't know, is it's very hard to predict what's going to happen when you have a whole ecosystem, a whole food web. Multiple stressors, so like light and nutrients and temperature and CO2 are all changing at the same time. And coastal dynamics, that sort of picture we had of different upwelling and the sediments and all this, the system is complicated and it's hard to predict. And I think I'm going to give you a couple examples of sort of interesting and perhaps unexpected outcomes when people have looked at this. So this is one that came out last year. And it's a place where there's a CO2 vent in the ocean. So it's sort of naturally acidifying this sort of local area around it. And there's this very sort of simple system where you've got this algae that grows on the substrate, on the rocks. And you have these snails that crawl around and they eat the algae. So this is kind of the normal abundance of these calcifying shelled animals. This is what it looks like in the area where there's extra CO2, so sort of the future scenario. You can see there's a lot of this algae that's growing, presumably because it has more carbon. And there's also a lot of these calcifiers. So in the balance between having more food and having more carbon, having more food seems to have a bigger influence here, right? Like they're like, yeah, it's harder to build a shell, but look at all this great algae. So that was an interesting example. Clownfish are another interesting example of sort of looking at what happens in the real world. So if you put clownfish in high CO2 water, they gain speed and agility. I don't know how you measure clownfish agility, but I guess they do. So they gain speed and agility, so if you sort of stop there, you'd be like, okay, clownfish, they like it when there's more CO2. But they have this setup where they can have like 2 different channels that they can swim into, and they put the smell of a predator in the one channel and the other one is safe. And normally they obviously choose to swim where the predator isn't, but under high CO2, they start swimming towards the smell of the predator, which is probably not an adaptive behavior in the long run for the clownfish. So, and this is a pattern that has been established in a bunch of different species, that ocean acidification tends to damage the olfactory responses of fish. Yeah, okay, so it maybe confuses their responses to their olfactory input. Yeah, right, yeah, it's not that they're not smelling, but that they're not responding to the smell. Yeah, yeah. So, there's lots of examples like this where like the simple answer turns out to be not the full answer, of kind of thinking about how animals and plants will actually behave or thrive or not in the future. Okay, so let's talk about herring. So Pacific herring, they're pretty little fish. This is work that was done by my student Christina. I'll show you a picture of her in a minute. They spawn around 3 to 4 years of age. They live up to 19 years old. Although one of the things that's been observed in the local herring stocks is that they're not living that long anymore. The sort of age class is getting younger and younger, which is problematic. And then the adults are commercially harvested for sport fishing bait, but they're also, very important ecologically. So, we've got phytoplankton and zooplankton, which are being consumed by these forage fish, and then the forage fish are being consumed by a large variety of important local species. Okay, so here's our region, the Salish Sea. Here are the locations of the 18 different Pacific herring spawn stocks around the Puget Sound, including Cherry Point up there at the top. So Christina's fish were from Cherry Point, and one thing that's interesting about the herring, which I think you guys already know, right, is that they spawn in shallow water of depths, usually 3 meters or less, and they generally spawn on marine vegetation, so kelp and eelgrass. And other algae as well. Yeah, yeah. So we already know some things, or we suspect some things about Pacific herring reaction to increased CO2 and increased temperature, which is what my students' experiments were about. And a lot of this is based on actually Atlantic herring. There's been a lot more research done on Atlantic herring through European scientists. So we really expected there was probably going to be no direct effect of CO2 on the herring. We just looked at herring embryos. Basically, we fertilized them and did them up until hatching. Most of the Atlantic herring studies have shown like no big effect of CO2 on them. So that's kind of what we expected to see. However, we know that temperature does have a big effect on both Pacific and Atlantic herring. And some of the effects of having a higher temperature are that they develop faster, so they hatch more quickly, which seems like it's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's generally accompanied by a lot of deformities. So as they sort of have this accelerated development, they don't develop properly in many cases. So there's some of the kind of big expected effects of temperature. And then when you add CO2 and temperature together, that was our question that we were looking at of what's going to happen. So here's Christina out with the DFW in her Mustang suit collecting some part of the biomass survey and also collecting some animals to use for spawning experiments. You think that they're spawning late, but she went out on several of their ones, so it was actually snowy that day. But we ended up using ones that were collected up at Cherry Point. And so we measured fertilization success. This is a fertilized egg, and that's one that did not get fertilized. Heart rates, which this oh, yeah, we'll see. There's a little video here, so you can see right there? That's the heart of the little herring embryo beating. So Christina spent a lot of time looking, taking these videos through a microscope and then counting the heartbeats of each one of these little embryos to measure their heart rates. Embryo mortality, these are living embryos and these are ones that died. Hatching success, and you can see here what some of those deformed larvae look like. They get these curved spines and so forth. They can't really swim very well when they're like that. And then larval length and weight were some of the things that we measured. So, yep, that's their yolk sac. This little thing here is the yolk sac. That's another thing we really actually wanted to measure, was getting some measures of yolk sac volume, but our images weren't good enough to be able to measure that very well. Okay, so warmer temperature, not really surprisingly, was a primary stressor affecting the Pacific herring. So our warm temperature was 16 degrees, which is 60 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to 50 degrees or 10 degrees Celsius, which was our cooler temperature. Embryo heart rates went up, which isn't too much of a surprise. Like when temperature goes up, sort of metabolic rates go up, you expect heart rates to go up. And embryo mortality went up, and hatching success and larval lengths went down. So in general, this high temperature was not good for the herring embryos. Part of this is this energy demand, right? As temperature increases, energy demand also increases. And here's where we've got CO2 and temperature together. So these are the different treatments here, where this is the CO2 and this is the temperature. So this one is high CO2, low temperature. And that's embryo mortality. So how many of them, what percentage didn't make it? So just to kind of unpack it a little bit, here's the current CO2 and the lower temperature, and about 20% of the embryos don't make it. At higher temperature, which is this one, about 40% don't make it. If you change just the CO2 but not the temperature, doesn't really do anything. But if you have high CO2 and high temperature, then it's about a 60% mortality rate. So CO2 by itself isn't that much of a challenge for these guys, but added on top of high temperature, it does increase the mortality rate quite a bit. So what I'm not saying is that the herring are doomed. Not what I'm saying. Because once again, it's complicated. So in this lab study, we did show that yeah, the combination of temperature and CO2 increased mortality and increased heart rate, sort of their energy consumption rate. There was another study, however, that came out recently where they looked at Posthatch Atlantic herring, but it's they're closely related. And what they saw was that the ones in the high CO2 actually did better than the ones in the low CO2. And they think it's because the food supply was better. They had these sort of mesocosms where they had a plankton community in there with the herring, and the herring were, grazing. And because the phytoplankton were doing better, the zooplankton were doing better, there were more copepods for them to eat. And similar to the story with the algae and the snails, right? Like the better and more food seem to counteract and be more powerful of an effect than the challenges from the CO2. So it's complicated, and there's more of a, that our lab study is a piece of information to the puzzle, but not the answer. Do you have a question?
Your lab studies, did they have a food supply as well?
We only did them up until hatching, so there was no feeding. Yeah, so you can imagine a scenario where there's fewer of them hatch, but of the ones that hatch, they might have greater survival after that, maybe. So how that would all play out, is anyone's guess until someone does some experiments to try to put it all together.
The current situation having a 20% mortality rate, is there a lower point at which the mortality rate is lower? I mean, lower conditions, temperature, and CO2?
Yes, so if you look at just temperature, and I took that slide out too. I mean, like with many environmental things, there's a curve, right? So they have an ideal temperature range, and when you go on either side of that, then they're unhappy. They don't survive as well. And since we only did 2 temperatures, we can't say anything about where's the cut, is there a tipping point, or is it just a gradual change in between? We don't know. All right. So, yeah, I mean, so we can think about food supply. Also, another thing to think about, like in this image, is, as we've mentioned several times, they spawn on vegetation. And we've also said several times that vegetation really changes the local chemistry. So, does it make a difference if, like in the experiment that we did, they just had low CO2 or high CO2 all the time? What if they have CO2 that's going up and down on a daily basis? There have been some studies with different species that have shown that that type of up and down is actually not as damaging as just having high CO2 all the time. So that's another possibility of a realistic situation that we don't know yet the effect that it actually has on these organisms. Okay, so we've already talked about most of these points, but I'm adding in another one, which is that effects are widespread, but not easily predictable. And scientists are hard at work on trying to unpack these questions, but we're only a little of the ways along that road. Okay, so what you can do. When I started out as like a scientist giving these talks, I didn't do this part, but now I do. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'm going to do it anyway. So, be engaged in political action and support responsible climate policies. So we're talking about, getting involved with the leadership, support the carbon fee initiative, support local quality efforts, like resources. You guys are all here. I know you're already doing that part. So, so keep up the good work and keep spreading the word. Reduce your nitrogen and nutrient input or footprint, because that really makes a difference locally. So septic maintenance, rain gardens, using fertilizer, that sort of thing. So your own using fertilizer properly. So your own footprint in terms of nutrients, you can have an impact on that. And then of course your carbon footprint. So I want to do a little exercise here. I think, yeah, you don't have to write it down, although I think it's a good idea if you do, or at least like have it in your mind. Like what are the top 3 ways that you can reduce your carbon footprint? And just give you a minute to think about it, just among yourselves. That's one of them. Okay, so this is a study that came out last year where they were looking at like what are the most effective actions that people can take, just individual decisions, like everyday decisions that people can make. So this is emission savings per year over here, and then high impact is green. You get the picture. The different countries have different levels here. So have one fewer child is number 1. I mean, there's a few people in the room who probably aren't making childbearing decisions, but but it's for real. I mean, I think the first time someone told me this was probably like a decade ago, and I kind of like poo-pooed it. I was like, oh, come on. I mean, like, who's gonna like make that kind of a decision based on their carbon footprint? But this is for real. I mean, like, if we're gonna do something about climate change and about carbon emissions, we have to make it central to our decision-making processes, the big ones and the little ones. So have a fewer child. Live car free is the second one here. So not like driving your car less or like having a more fuel efficient car. Those are around here too. Like the gasoline, get a hybrid is over here. But like actually not drive your car at all. Again, like big things that are hard to do have bigger impact. I mean, this one is tough for people. Avoid a transatlantic flight. Like, local flight, yeah. I mean, like flying from here to Seattle. Yeah. Right, those short hop flights, because it's all takeoff and landing. They're very intensive. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in that one, you know, like, it's not an easy decision, right? Like if it's, you know, like you're going to visit your family, this is your one chance, you know, to see them. It's not easy. None of this is easy, but it's important. So we don't have to go through every single one of these, except to point out that a lot of the things that people might think of as doing or that people are told to do, you know, are the easy things, like upgrade your light bulbs, which is great. Everyone should upgrade their light bulbs. But what you shouldn't do is be like, I upgraded my light bulbs, check, I'm done, I'm off to Hawaii. Because that happens, yeah.
I heard in one study a month or two ago, they mentioned the carbon footprint from shellfish is actually less than eating vegan.
Yeah, shellfish are really good in terms of carbon footprint. Yep, there's some really positive choices that you can make. All right. So yeah, like I said, I didn't used to get into all this, but now I do. That's my son. He's 8, and that's why, right? I mean, with this recent IPCC report, you know, like, I don't even have the luxury of thinking that I'm going to be dead and gone when he has to deal with the consequences of this. Like, it's here, and it's going to be in his lifetime and my lifetime. So we need to be serious. All right. So this is my favorite cartoon. You may not be able to read it, but it says, "Day 44, still stranded with nothing but flat, empty water as far as the eye can see," which I think really encapsulates sort of how the human experience and understanding of the ocean is limited, right? There's all these things that are going on that we can't see and that we don't understand. So we still have a lot to learn, and that maybe caution about changing the world when we don't understand the consequences is a good place to start. All right. I think we have a couple minutes left here. Have more questions? Yes?
Have any way of adjusting the local pH of the water so they can make their shells here? Or does it just take, you know, I have to work harder?
Yeah, so there is some, I have a couple of answers to that. That, yeah, they're not always necessarily just completely exposed to the ocean. Many of them have organic coatings that are around, or that can be around some of their calcifying parts, or they can create conditions inside that are more favorable. It's one of the reasons that Olympia oysters may be more resistant to ocean acidification, because they brood their larvae inside, so that the larvae are not just exposed to ambient conditions in terms of CO2. So when they're very young, they're still inside the shell of the female. Also, the idea of oyster reefs, right? That oysters like to settle on oyster shells. So having all this calcium carbonate around that's slowly dissolving it's possible that it has a very local effect on the water chemistry. But that's a little bit theoretical. Nobody has actually shown a benefit of that yet. So for the most part, they're pretty much in the ambient environment. Yeah. Yes?
Has your lab looked into like how invasive species respond to ocean acidification?
That's an interesting question. So we actually looked at japonica, which is the non-native eelgrass species. And it turns out it responds a lot more strongly to increased CO2 than marina does. So it's possible that places that have japonica, that its benefit for the water will be stronger in the future because it will be taking out more carbon. Some people don't like japonica, but I have a soft spot for it.
Where does sargassum fit in?
I don't know a lot about sargassum. Certainly, a lot of the macroalgae have ability to form these blooms, right? I mean, they can grow. They have this explosive growth potential, and right, and so if they experience carbon limitation during this, which I imagine they must, at some point, if there's more carbon around, then they'll be able to grow even more. Would be my sort of baseline guess of what could go on there, but I don't know. I haven't looked into it.
You've got a lot of sargassum in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and then it will have this cyclical effect, right? Like it'll draw down the CO2 while it's growing, and then it'll release all that CO2 back into the water when it decays, or into the air. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for coming.